So last time we had you on to talk about China and the Middle East, we recorded it on October 6th, and things changed the next day.
Yeah, I don't know how it affected your viewership, but I know that for me, starting from that next day, really all the way through to now, everything is kind of different. I mean, it's sort of the same stuff I do anyway, but it's still a lot. Certainly, a lot has changed, and not for the better.
Yeah, well, oh boy, yeah, it's been a nightmare following all of this. Very contentious topics. So
let's jump right in.
Yeah, well, I think we'll focus a lot on still the China angle,
of course,
and the United States views Hamas as a terrorist organization. At least the official government does. Some people in the United States apparently have other ideas about Hamas. But anyway, how does China view Hamas?
Well, Hamas is not a registered foreign terrorist organization in Beijing, which is unfortunately the case in much of the world. It's really only the U.S., some of Central American countries, some Western European countries, and a couple of miscellaneous others that officially label Hamas that way. So for China, China's position is that Hamas is a legitimate political party. On occasion, they have referred to it as a resistance movement, although I should say I don't know for sure whether that is a function of translation or not, because I don't believe they've used those words in English, to my knowledge. But they kind of use those interchangeably. They don't use the word terrorist. They have not condemned the Hamas attack per se, other than in the context of, it's always a tragedy when civilians die on both sides. Like, they've sort of both sides it. They've to some extent whatabouted it. And as you may have seen, just a few days ago, the IDF in Gaza found a stockpile of Chinese manufactured weapons. Israel has been very disappointed in China's response, and that's really sort of the icing on a kind of disgusting cake that no one would want to eat, I guess.
Well, with those weapons, do you think that was an issue of China directly selling it to Hamas, or is it like the AK-47 where those are just kind of everywhere and they got some?
I think it's actually a bit in between, right? So there's no evidence to suggest, nor is there any particular reason why China would take the risk of attempting to sell weapons directly to Hamas. But what we know that China does do is China arms Iran with a wide range of weapons. And, on the one, that's bad enough for all sorts of reasons we can talk about and have talked about the last time I was on. But what that does is it both allows Iran to freeze up other weapons that they may or may not need to sell to Hamas, or really to give to Hamas. But it also means Iran can, if it so chooses, act as a pass-through and take those Chinese weapons and deliver them to Hamas. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that the intent of China is to give them to Hamas for use against Israel. However, as a major trading partner of Iran, as one of the most significant suppliers of weapons to Iran, it certainly is within China's power to say, look, these weapons cannot go outside of Iran, right? They can be used to defend the Iranian state, but if we see evidence that they are being transmitted to groups like Hamas to use in attacks on states that they themselves have a lot of business with, then we're going to cut you off, right? So there are steps they could take to potentially mitigate the flow of Chinese weapons into Gaza that clearly they either are unable or unwilling to take. And we'll see how they react over the coming days as this becomes a bigger and bigger story in the Israeli press. I would hope it breaks through a bit in the U.S. press. I think it's broken through a little, but as it becomes more widely reported.
So has there been any response from the Chinese side so far?
Not really. I mean, not yet. I mean, it happened just a few days ago. China has essentially no commented it. I imagine it will. They have not made any sort of official statement on the conflict in Gaza in the last 2 weeks or so. I think since around December 13th. I could be off by a couple of days. And so it hasn't really been directly addressed. I would imagine that they will say that it's their policy not to give weapons to Hamas, but who knows? Things happen, that would be what I would imagine they would say.
Yeah, so it seems to me like China doesn't, explicitly condemn Hamas, and they certainly don't go out of their way to prevent their weapons from getting into the hands of Hamas. Are there ways China is directly supporting Hamas?
Well, I think for Hamas, the most important thing that they need right now is political support in international institutions and in some sense sort of on the street. Now, unfortunately, and almost totally mind-boggling to me, even after studying this region for more than 20 years, they have a lot of support in the street here in the US and in Western Europe and stuff all too much. But what they don't have here is political support. And they don't have backing at the UN from the US or even or any of our Western allies. And that's something that China and Russia can provide. And so in the UN system, China acts, I don't want to say they act on behalf of Hamas, which implies that they're sort of taking direction, which is not the case. But they certainly are a roadblock to getting anything through the Security Council that is realistic for the US to sign on to, anything that is realistic for Israel to agree to, anything that actually would promote some sort of wider resolution. And so, in some sense, where it counts, China does what it can to help Hamas politically. It doesn't, not to the extent of Iran, right? China does not have a policy of trying to destroy Israel, right? They have fundamental disagreements with Hamas on a couple of key things, not least is that certainly the role of religion in public life is another. But they do have some significant shared interests that I think in Beijing, they see that the best way they can assist without being dragged into a fight is either blocking U.S. attempts to counter Hamas or sort of indirectly-ish standing up for them in international fora.
Well, I know the Chinese Communist Party loves its unrestricted warfare and fanning the flames of political divide in the U.S. Do you get a sense they are involved in or taking advantage of the political turmoil that this is causing within the U.S.? Because, as you mentioned, it's become a very
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that this is one of the two sort of core interests that China has here. One, right, is exactly as you say, that they're using this as a way to, is similar to what Russia has done for years, as a way to divide American society and Western society, to highlight divisions, especially between young people. As I'm sure your listeners, many of your listeners have read and seen reports on early on, there was a lot of indication that the TikTok algorithm was promoting pro-Hamas posts and sort of disseminating that view to a lot of people who maybe knew nothing about this conflict. And their first exposure is these sort of catchy, pro-Hamas clips that then leads to other ones and leads to other ones. Now, you could say that people say, oh, well, China doesn't do that with TikTok. But leaving aside, we know that they do in some cases. This, in the few days leading up to President Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping, that was really ramped down. And the viewership of pro-Hamas, or the viewership, but forget the word for the number of times it will appear, right? That it was not promoting or highlighting those videos in the 5 or 6 days leading up to that meeting on the West Coast. And it has sustained at a bit of a lower level than it was earlier on since then, right? And I don't think anyone thinks that's coincidental. I think that they were trying to sort of tone it down a bit in advance of what were going to be some tough discussions, I think, with the U.S. And unfortunately, I think that's been quite effective. And the other thing, sort of core interest that China has in this conflict, is not, again, it's not that they have common cause with Hamas on like sort of Hamas's core issues, right? Like China, there's no indication China wants to destroy Israel. That makes no sense. First of all, for them, Israel is all too willing to accept Chinese investment. But what they have in common with Hamas and with Russia and with North Korea and with Iran and other groups is this desire to undermine not just the international order, in a large scale, but to undermine the premise of state sovereignty and non-territorial, the acquiring of territory by force, right? And Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map. Iran wants to wipe Israel off the map. Russia wants to wipe Ukraine off the map. North Korea wants to wipe South Korea off the map. They sort of said that more explicitly even just last week. And China wants to do the same to Taiwan. And in some sense has done that to Tibet and elsewhere already long ago. And so they have this shared sort of vision of the world, even if they might have some very strong disagreements about specific policies sort of along the way.